This is the Initiates Podcast. Here, we create space to explore the path of initiation as we reawaken the forgotten wisdom that resides within us all. I am your host and guide, Natalie Grace. Join me every Thursday for an enlightening exploration of contemporary spirituality. It's my honour to journey with you. Hello, beautiful friends. Thank you so much for joining me. On today's episode, I'm going to be expanding on the subject of fear I started talking about last week in episode 21, the love-fear axis. I focused quite heavily on love last week, but I was reminded as I was recording that episode that I received quite a profound wisdom teaching from the Akashic Records at the height of the craziness of the pandemic. I live very close to Melbourne, and my family is in Melbourne. And for those that aren't aware, Melbourne was one of the most locked down places in the world. There was an extreme intensity in the collective field for a really long time here. And the message that came through was all about the power of the vibration of fear and how that works in our world and how it works with Gaia. So it's a really interesting lesson. It has to do with weather events. It has to do with energy and vibration. It has to do with our emotional state as individuals. What happens when our energy hits a critical mass in the collective, where all of a sudden it becomes out of balance, which is what happened at this particular time in the location where I live, very close to where I live. It also speaks very briefly about climate change, which is a bit of a controversial subject. So I'm going to be exploring that in a bit more detail in the reflection following the channel teaching. You might remember me mentioning last week that I was thinking about recording this, just the teaching itself, and sharing it as a bonus episode. But when it came to recording it, I remembered how juicy this teaching was, how important it felt when I received it at that time, because we were in such a state of collective fear. It felt like I was given an insight that helped me navigate out of that emotion. And I definitely wasn't holding as much fear as many, many people individually were at that time. But I was definitely feeling the collective fear. And there were some really interesting social events that were happening at this time in the kind of mass consensus reality, as well as in my own local personal space. What prompted me to ask the records about basically destructive weather events. That's my line of questioning, to understand those in more detail, where they come from, why they exist, what they're here to teach us. These events were happening literally on my doorstep. And so it was, I say it a few times in this teaching, but as above, as below, as within, as without. It was like that in my world. You know, there was inner turmoil happening in the microcosm that was being reflected at scale in the macrocosm. It was a really intense time. I'm kind of glad we've navigated out of that time, but it also held so much wisdom for us if we were willing to go there, if we were willing to delve into these uncomfortable feelings and ask some really hard questions of ourselves, but also of the records or whatever higher source of wisdom you like to tap into. Because to be able to get past the fear of asking and wanting to know why, instead of just accepting what we were told, which was really hard to kind of go along with for many of us who have a more curious mindset. There was so much to be learned, and I know so many of us went through a really intense awakening at that time, deep shadow work, deep dark nights of the soul. So having had quite a big chunk of time now since I wrote this message, Again, I mentioned last week, I don't want to make premonitions that anything bad is coming, and whatever is coming next for us, we are so equipped to deal with. We have had such incredible training. What we went through at the time I wrote this message into my journal was like a boot camp. It was a spiritual boot camp. It was a reality boot camp as well. It was very 3D. It was an emotional boot camp. So we're not underprepared. We are prepared. But for some reason, I am called to speak about the vibration of fear right now, to go into this second episode talking about the vibration of fear. So take that as you will. At the very least, it's a good reminder for us about the incredible power of the emotion of fear and the way that it is used, it is harnessed, it is propelled by those who hold power in our society to alter our reality in a way that suits their agenda, whatever that may be. Okay, with all that said, let's journey. Question. Yesterday we had a large storm. The force of the wind uprooted trees, blocking the road into the town right outside our property. The weather feels different this year, cyclonic, wet, even an earthquake. Why are we experiencing destructive weather, and what is its purpose? Where does this destructive and powerful force come from? What is it wanting us to see? Answer. These intense weather events want you to see what is written, and they pointed to a page in the book. For your people to be reminded that they must follow the universal laws, the book of the law, so to speak. As above, so below. As within, so without. The book of the law states that man has free will. Where you exist on the earth plane, man is attempting to rewrite these laws, to remove one's divine will to choose their own destiny. It is not so much the laws of democracy, the social contracts that have served your kind in recent times. It is the rules allowing one to follow their own instincts, to make decisions based on their own thinking and feeling. This form of control goes against the universal law. This week, in your realm, new laws were introduced. This is just the current step of installing these laws of control. The events leading up to this point, this announcement of the intention to control, has been building over time. As above, so below. Gaia has been building her response. Gaia's intensity is increasing in resonance with oppression of man's will. Such assaults on the universal law disrupt the cosmic balance of energies. This results in Gaia needing to restore balance. Think of the good that you witnessed yesterday. Pleasant exchanges of energy with neighbours, good deeds, sharing and giving, hard work undertaken to restore balance to your town. This is the response in man, the normal response. The normal response to Gaia's disruptions. She is indeed sending a message. She is unhappy with the oppression of the many by the few. The few have stolen power and their punishment is coming. Gaia is merciful, but as you are aware, she does not need man and has the ability to destroy your species at will. She will never go that far unless her hand is forced, if the harmonic balance of cosmic energy becomes too disturbed. The cause of this disruption to the balance is the collective resonance of fear. This is concentrated heavily in your area of the world right now. The energy of fear is extremely powerful and, if maintained en masse, extremely disruptive to your collective field. It creates tension and sickness for the life around you. It impacts all life beyond humans, and this is why Gaia is forced to respond. She's creating distractions to this energy. The storm phenomena creates shock, but quickly shifts the energy higher where humans swing into action to help one another out of duty, kindness, compassion, and unconditional love. This phenomena is healing to your energy field, even when it causes death. People commune in love around tragedy. But the few understand this, as above, so below, and it is a threat. They know what actions are coming from Gaia, her inevitable response to their plans, and this is why they are reframing the cause around the concept of climate change. They plan for the many to blame themselves for Gaia's actions, when she is responding to the few to help re-establish balance for the many. There will be more storms, but know that this is not caused by poor recycling or the use of fossil fuels, although disrespect of Gaia's abundance creates separate reactions. It is a direct response to the build-up of fear energy in the many, in reaction to attempts to rob the many of their free will. There will always be consequences. All right, that was a pretty big, intense lesson. And because it was in response to some real world events that were happening in my region of the world, I think it's important to set the scene so you understand the context for why I was asking these questions about weather events, how they'd impacted me personally, and why it was such a profound realization to make that connection between us as humans holding the earth frequency as, as parts of the earth, and our connection to Gaia, and Gaia as ultimately the divine mother who's responsible for all of her children and the welfare of all of her children, which expands much further beyond just human life. So I have some reflections. So the first thing I'm going to do is just set the scene for you about what was happening here and why the energy was so intense and how that created such an literally earth-shattering response. And then I'm going to reflect on a few different aspects of the lesson. I wasn't planning on getting controversial, but I do want to say I'm going to be very honest with my opinions about the environmentalism side of this message. I encourage you to keep an open mind there, because my perspective has come from this lived experience, but also my experience growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, where these issues were talked about in a really different way. And it's kind of just stuck with me, this distrust of these more current narratives around the environment. So I'm going to be talking about that too. But first, let's set the scene. So when I checked the journal entry, this particular channeled message was recorded in my journal on the 30th of October, 2021. This was a really, really intense time where I live. I was lucky enough to have the premonition to leave the inner city in 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And that served me well. I wasn't far from the city, but it was far enough that I wasn't impacted in the same way as my family and friends who really had their movements limited. So at this time, the 30th of the 10th, 2021, Melbourne, I think, had officially become the most locked down place in the world. We'd gone beyond 270 days or something like that of lockdown. And these lockdowns were incredibly strict. They had such an immense impact on the energy of the broader community of this place. We It was similar things to what other people were dealing with in other lockdown areas. We had playgrounds closed. We had beaches closed too for a fair while. Our travel was limited to an hour a day for a long time within a 5 kilometre, which equates to about a 3-mile radius. And there were really strict rules on our reasons for travel. It got to the point where police were intercepting people as they were doing their daily exercise, walking in parks, checking their coffee cups. There was video footage of this, of a cop checking someone's coffee cup to see if it really had coffee in it, or they were just pretending to be drinking coffee, because if you were drinking coffee, you didn't have to wear a mask, right? If you were eating or drinking. So the cops were literally checking people's food and drink to see if they could give them a fine, basically. It was a really, really intense, but I want to say also crazy time. It was a really unbalanced, unhinged time. We also had what was dubbed the Ring of Steel placed around our city's highways to create I wrote virtual border here in my notes, but it wasn't virtual. It was completely real. It was a hard border policed by the military. It was military checkpoints that prevented people from travelling into and from the city unless they had the correct papers. So this literally prevented me from visiting my family, even if I wanted to, because I wouldn't have had permission. I did travel through this checkpoint once when I needed to take my cat to the vet, and I was assured that it would be fine because that's a decent reason to enter the city. But it was still a very strange experience. I know it's probably normalised for a lot of people who travel between my region and the city who had work permits, so it just became a normal thing. But it was a very strange experience not having to deal with that every day. It was very unnerving. And I don't think that was something that happened in many places. So this is the vibe of the place where I lived at the time that this message was received. And life, I think most people would say, was really difficult. I do have my own opinions on whether all this was justified based on the experience we lived through, especially with some hindsight, but also with my own intuition of what was happening. I don't really want to get into that on this episode because that's firstly not what it's about. But second, I don't really want to make this episode, or more importantly, this lesson from the records, hyper politicized around the pandemic. It's not my intention at all. I really just want to remind everyone of what was happening at this time because it feels so long ago now, and it's almost becoming surreal to think about what we did live through in 2020 and 2021. And I also really want to make sure that I'm describing this as in a way that's detailed enough for you to remember or be able to imagine how such an intense vibration of fear was able to brew and simmer, especially where I lived. So after over 250 days of people, the entire public here being locked down, various industries were applying mandates for the poke, I want to say, one by one. We got the poke a fair while after many other countries. So these mandates were happening a little bit later than other places. And I want to say that when they first started rolling out, it was really reasonable. You know, the industries that were issuing these mandates were within healthcare settings, aged care settings. It made a lot of sense. But once it started spreading to other industries that were outside of health settings, people started to get a bit concerned if they weren't interested in being forced to take a medicine to keep their job. And it was pushed by the government. The government set the rules for which industries were required to push these mandates. So it began with healthcare, and then it moved to kind of crowded sort of public settings and, you know, public-facing settings. But even then, there is potential to understand this rationale. But things started to get really intense when there was a mandate pushed on the building and construction industry here in the state of Victoria where I live. And people in that industry were angry. Obviously, there's a lot of working class people in that industry weren't really interested in having the medicine in order to work. And they were even angrier that their unions were requiring this because we have a very, very strong union presence in this state. And it wasn't something we should, if you follow politics at all, you should expect the unions to back the Labor Party of the day. But it still seemed potentially, if you don't think on that kind of level, like an un-union-like response, requiring members to be poked. So this pressure that was building really got to a boiling point as the mandate dates started to get nearer and nearer. And we reached this boiling point in Melbourne where riots were happening in the CBD. And on one particular day in September, the builders decided to riot their own union's headquarters. And this was a huge protest, but it wasn't the biggest, I want to say, I don't think. It was probably the most violent, the most aggressive, the most angry, and it was definitely the first protest that had received any meaningful press coverage. And there had been plenty of protests before this that were ignored. There was definitely a media blackout. There was no airtime at all given to the side that opposed the prevailing narrative that the media were pushing and the government was pushing. But what was weird about this particular protest that did become a riot was that it was covered non-stop, broadcast live on every TV station for hours. For the whole time it happened, it was a deliberate decision to cover this particular protest. And I have lots of opinions on why this is, but again, I don't want to go down that path. I really do want to remain neutral and just talk about what happened here to focus on the lesson. But the most important thing to note is that this really, really intense energy of fear that had been simmering for so many weeks, so many months, was literally at boiling point at this stage. And I think this happened on the 20th of September, 2021. So that's a little over a month before I received this channeled message from the Akashic Records. So this boiling point, it wasn't just coming from one side either. I want to say that this energy of intensity had been created by all sides. No matter which side you fell on, you were a part of this energy. And even if you were desperately attempting to stay neutral, the collective energy was so strong that there was no way to avoid it. You had the masses terrified of the illness and its potential to spread. And then you also had on the other side people who were really fearful and angry at the government response that was imposing on their free will to do basic things like travel and to work and to see family. And so then people are angry at what's happening, but then they also become really angry at each other. And the way I see this is there's a vortex of this fear energy that just began to propel. I want to say that's how I was witnessing the energy at the time. That's how I was feeling it and imagining it and visualizing it. It was a vortex that was just getting stronger and stronger and larger. And at that point, when it reached that high and low of the riot, the entire population of our state and even beyond our state into other areas of the country had been whipped up into such a frenzy by this particular event, but also what was leading up to it, mostly because we don't have riots here. We don't do that sort of stuff here. We never aggressively demand the government changes what they're doing. Other countries have a culture of doing that. We don't. I think it probably comes from the fact that we are a convict colony and we are largely descended from convicts here, that it's part of our culture that we do what we're told. At that point, the vast majority, I want to say the absolutely vast majority of the population here was complicitly obeying all the directions without a murmur. And the people that were speaking up were either targeted and made an example of in rare cases, but largely were completely ignored and blocked out. So the fact that this riot was happening on TV for everyone to see had just whipped everyone up into such a frenzy that this energy, this fear energy, this anger energy, this extremely intense low vibration frequency it couldn't be stopped after that point. It had created its own entity, and it was taking over. It was like a cloud that was enveloping us all. And so if you think back to the vortex I just described, it's shooting up, up, up into the atmosphere, and it's shooting up with such force that it's picking up everything in its path, kind of like a cyclone. So if you imagine a cyclone, it's like a super destructive force. It's kind of cone-shaped. But cyclones are also like a leveling force. And after receiving this lesson from the records, I realized that the vortex doesn't just go up. It also went down into the earth. So the energy of this vortex, it's like two cones touching each other at the 0 point, if that makes sense. So if you imagine a cyclone the right way up with its 0 point touching the earth, and then another mirror image upside down that expands into the earth, that's kind of how I saw it, kind of just projecting. And it was projecting the energy that we were creating and reinforcing. It's projecting it, amplifying it. That's another way to think about this kind of visual is speaker cones. Their job is to amplify upward and downward. And it's completely disrupting the natural balance or the natural order. There was no peace. There was no harmony. It was very hard to connect with another human. Honestly, that you didn't know. The normal kind of rapport you would have with strangers, which is either a neutrality, or if you interact with someone at a shop or something like that, there might be some just base level sort of friendliness or kindness, but all that had just disappeared. There was this complete sense, energy of distrust, of judgment, of fear, of anger. And obviously, as we've learned now from this lesson in the records, that energy wasn't just affecting us. It was smothering, infecting perhaps every other life form in our locale, in our vicinity. So I hope that was detailed enough for you to understand the social and energetic climate that we were existing in at that time. Now I want to tell you about the weather events that followed this event. And I think we all know that the weather has been getting pretty extreme. There were multiple kind of extreme weather events that were happening in 2020, 2021, even 2022. You know, we've had in Australia crazy fires, like really intense flooding, all kinds of storms. So, you know, we're kind of already used to that. But what came after this riot was so different, and I want to say bizarre, that it's very clear that it was orchestrated by Gaia for a specific purpose. So that day of the riot, I think that was the 20th of September, it was very unnerving. I remember watching that. I didn't have a TV set up in my house at that time. I wasn't really taking in that information via that method. I was more reading about stuff that was happening on the internet, staying up to date that way. But very funny I should say this actually, because I'm talking about how ungrounded the energy was, how whipped up into the air we all were, into the thought realm, that on that particular day I was getting tires on my car fixed. And so I was sitting inside, which I guess was a permitted activity. I think by that stage we were all getting a bit tired of following the rules, and we were taking liberties where we could get them. So I needed to replace my tires. So I was sitting in the tire shop with my partner, a very, very working class work environment. And there was a television set on in the foyer. And so we, along with the staff who weren't working on cars, were in the foyer just watching with our mouths open pretty much what was unfolding on this TV. Very different people. It was very interesting, the different commentary people were making as they were watching the TV. But I want to say that the energy of that riot day was very ungrounded. I want to say, if we talk about that cyclone again, it's like everyone had been taken by the cyclone and sent up into the air and trapped in that force of the cyclone without knowing how to get out of it. We were all really trapped in this like very dark energy, completely ungrounded. And as you all know by now, I am intuitive. I'm claircognizant. That's my strongest clair sense. And I had a knowing that that energy just couldn't remain that way without something really, really bad coming. Something huge there was no way for that energy to just dissipate naturally. Something would have to explode. However, I would never have guessed what happened next. I thought there was going to be some huge event like a false flag or some kind of riot that resulted in a lot of violence. That's not what happened. That's what felt like was going to happen. And I think a lot of people, intuitive or not, would have agreed with that. But of all things, 2 days later, an earthquake struck. Now, this is so bizarre because earthquakes don't really happen where I am in the kind of Melbourne-ish region of Victoria. We might experience tiny tremors that someone in a couple of suburbs might feel or in a town might feel, but they can't really put their finger on what it was. And you find out 2 days later that there was an earthquake that registered on the scale and it was like 3 point something. We might have that every now and then, but in my lifetime, I can't remember any kind of serious earthquake happening in Victoria. They really don't happen often in Australia at all. So this was a huge, confusing event. It was an earthquake of 5.9 magnitude, and its epicenter was not far out of Melbourne, maybe like a couple of hours, and it was felt all over Melbourne and beyond. And I remember when it happened, I was in my temple, my little room in the house where I do yoga and my rituals. I was doing my morning yoga. No one else was up. It wasn't that early or anything. I think it was like 8-ish in the morning. I didn't feel it, but I heard, because I was kind of doing some weird balancing anyway. I wish I did feel it. But what I did experience is that I heard a really strange noise. It was like a deep thunder, but it came from the roof in all directions. It wasn't like a lightning bolt hits after you hear some thunder and you know where the lightning hits. The whole roof had this sound and it was very odd, but it wasn't the loudest sound. So I noticed it was odd and I just kept doing what I was doing. My partner was in bed at the time. It did wake him up just in kind of a bit of a confused state. He said he did feel his bed kind of move, but I don't think he got up straight away. I think he went back to sleep and we talked about it later, and I just continued with my yoga. But not long after that, my phone started blowing up with messages on Telegram from my friends overseas asking me if I was okay. And I was like, what the hell? So I checked the news and every story was about the earthquake in Melbourne. This earthquake was felt right across the state, but interestingly, there was only like really minor damage to a couple of buildings. Anywhere really. I think there were 2 buildings in the Melbourne CBD where parts of the buildings crumbled off, but there wasn't much damage beyond that. I think even in the epicenter it didn't cause much destruction. But the destruction, the force of the earth moving was just enough to really shock us all. And this shock created a shift in the energy, and it was so sudden. It was so palpable as well. It was like someone had we know it was Gaia now, pressed a reset button for the energy, the collective energy, and we were immediately regrounded. This earth movement, this earth opening, regrounded us all. And it was exactly the event we needed to move on from that really imbalanced, polarized energy, that really low vibrational frequency that we were all just enveloped in. Like, I want to say it was stuck to us like goo. And this was an immediate cleanse. And so in that channeled message, it spoke of Gaia knowing how best to take action when it's required. When her hand is forced, she knows what to do in order to recalibrate the frequency in our human collective to make sure all living creatures are okay. And I believe that's what's happened. Gaia knew what to do, and then it was done, and that was that. The earth was rebalanced in our little world. And so, yeah, I am a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think I'm one of those theorists who believed it didn't happen and it was all orchestrated by the government. I do think it happened naturally, probably mostly because of this information that I've received from the records, but also because there was just universal confusion and I want to say almost happy excitement about it, something different and new to be talking about instead of the pandemic. Normally when events are planned and orchestrated and then rolled out, there's propaganda, there's messaging, there's narratives ready to be published immediately that support the desired outcome. And there was never any of that with this story. And there's no real villain with an earthquake, you know? With things like floods and fires, we can easily point blame that becomes politicized, that helps us understand or rationalize what's happened. But with this earthquake, that wasn't the knee-jerk response. We didn't even really get to that response. We just witnessed this earthquake and the intensity of Gaia's force. We allowed it to shock us and then we just let it go. It was so interesting and it was refreshing to have the ground, the earth speak to us in this way to remind us of our humanity. So that was something huge that happened. That was this oddity on the calendar. And then about a month later, based on my journal entry, which I think would have happened the day or two after this next storm that impacted me came through, a really intense weather system ripped through our state and did a fair amount of damage to the town I live in. I live on a part of the surf coast that's dubbed the Shipwreck Coast. So from that name, you can tell the weather can get pretty wild here. But since I've been living here, there's definitely been some wild weather, but there's been maybe 2 storms that have caused damage and nothing like this particular storm. So it was around 7 a.m. on this morning. And I remember because I was up at the time, the energy of the storm was so fierce and so disruptive that I couldn't sleep. I like sleeping in and I just couldn't do it. So this storm sweeps through the town quite quickly with these raging winds that were so strong and forceful that they uprooted this enormous row of giant cypress trees that border the highway opposite our house. These trees were lifted right out of the ground and then pounded back onto the road in front, and they took down the power lines with them. They left so much mess and destruction. It left the town without power, and interestingly enough, the power to our house was restored within hours, even though we were like one of the closest houses to this damage. But so many people in town were waiting days for their power to be restored. So this disruption took out the kind of network, if that makes sense. So it was a very grounding and calming force. Super amazing, probably a miracle. There were 2 different people traveling in cars when these trees fell and came down onto the road. Somehow they were able to walk free without injury. It definitely an angel was watching over those 2 people at that time, because if you saw the state of their cars after, which we did, and we heard from people there in the kind of rescue and cleanup crew that one car in particular had a huge limb come down in the center of the windscreen of the car. Somehow this person's head and body was spared. Even the rescuers, never seen anything like it, an absolute miracle. So no one was hurt in these storms. It was just damage and destruction, and Gaia kind of showing her force. And the lesson from the records makes specific mention of this day in this particular storm. So the storm passed quickly, and after it didn't seem dangerous to be outside anymore, my partner and I decided to put our raincoats on and walk around the town to kind of survey the damage. And it was pretty bad. There were poles down, there were trees down, so many trees down, huge trees, fences down all over the place. But the people we passed were so, so friendly. we were having conversations, we were talking, there was genuine care and love in our voices and eyes. There was bonding taking place. And this is important to note because at this time, this was peak paranoia and anger and judgment time. I'm sure many of you will relate to at this particular time, we'd forgotten to make, or we avoided making eye contact with people commonly. We weren't smiling or saying hello to people we would pass. And again, this was one of those reset events that reminded us that that was actually what we should be doing. We shouldn't be allowing masks or our fear to kind of get in the way of connecting with one another. So the road into town was blocked for, I think, 4 days or something like that. They had to remove so many trees. And over that time, we saw people of the town come together to clear up mess and repair damage. And it was really beautiful. It was such a nice thing to see. So that message that the energy can be rebalanced through these extreme weather events was evidence to me more than once. And it was what I was asking about. I was seeking that guidance, seeking that knowledge. And the answer that I was given makes such perfect sense based on what I witnessed, that especially in that really intense, ungrounded energy we were in, that by grounding us and disturbing our normal schedule, disturbing the energy pattern that we have settled into, or this unhelpful frequency that we're holding, Gaia can rebalance the collective field so that not only is the energy harmonized, but we're triggered to act on impulse and honor our true nature, which is to help, to connect, to act in love and be of service to each other. And like, how amazing, how beautiful, how powerful is that? And I'm sure you guys can relate to this being a real thing too, because anytime there is a violent or extreme weather event that causes damage, chaos, loss of life, injuries, we've seen it recently in earthquakes in Turkey, for instance, people come together to rescue, to help, to feed, to house, to clothe, to care for one another. That is our natural response. Our natural response is actually to come together. Our truest nature is to love one another, to show love, even to receive love. But unfortunately, this being our true nature has been distorted in so many ways, and we kind of forget or detach from this true nature. We feel somehow we get distorted into feeling it's more natural to act in competition with one another. And that's definitely what happened at this particular time in history. We had all detached from our true nature. We were all so quick to judge, to condemn, to hate, to dob each other in, as we say in Australia, to project anger and blame towards one another. And I want to be very clear on this. It does not matter which side you were on, because both sides were doing this. And that's precisely why Gaia had to intervene with that earthquake, because we no longer had any kind of balancing force within our own collective. We were vortexing out of control, and she needed to take control. So one of the most profound aspects of the lesson from the records is that Gaia's hand can be forced to create weather events, wild weather events, because we have put other forms of life in danger of harm. This is really profound to me because it touches on so many things. I was just talking about the human kind of experience of this energy, but we live in a world with so many non-human creatures. I honestly believe that every single object is living in some form. If it's vibrating enough to be seen, even if it's the most inanimate object you can think of, it's still got some kind of spirit to animate in that way. So everything here is living. It's not just us. And this is something we need to be so much more aware of. And I speak from my own experience here in my own microcosm. You know, I live on a farm. But even in my house, I don't spend enough time thinking about how my emotions, how my vibration, the vibration I carry, the vibration I'm projecting can impact my cat, my plants, my chickens. their health, their own emotional well-being, their vibrationary state. The bugs, the bird life, the rodents, the bats, everything in our sphere is impacted by the energy in your localized field and then our collective human field. So when collectively we fall out of balance, and if we're self-aware, we may know that we're impacting the well-being and even the physical health of other people that are in our vicinity. You know, if we're holding a lot of anger, if we're holding a lot of depressive energy, we know that impacts people in our vicinity. So even if we have that awareness that it's not good for us and others around us, we hardly ever honestly think about how that energy affects our ecosystem. That our energy is actually what causes imbalance to habitat, in illness to creatures and plants. And perhaps energetic imbalance and illness is not exclusively because of the energy we are projecting, but I definitely think it plays a huge role, and this lesson validates that. In the spiritual scene, we talk about Gaia a lot, and we talk about her as our divine mother who holds unconditional love for us. She supports us always. She's here to soak up our negative energy and transform it into something beautiful. All of that is true, except when we're causing her other children or her other creations harm, or we're the cause of disharmony in her sphere. Gaia is no longer this unconditionally loving mother. She then becomes this fearless warrior whose sole job is to protect her children. Her job is to hold balance, to hold the equilibrium that she created that's required to house all of her creations, not just us. And she does this with every heartbeat, with every breath, with every wave in the ocean, with every flap of a bird's wing. It's her maintaining her sacred balance, which is the vitality of the ecosystem of Earth. That sacred balance equals vitality of this ecosystem. And so if we're in the position where we're ignoring her love, ignoring her beautiful gifts, ignoring the absolute obvious abundance she provides for us, we're taking all that for granted, we're forgetting about all the other creatures and living organisms and even non-living organisms. Again, like I said before, I'm not sure that's even such a thing. Everything here holds some form of life. She has no choice but to use one of her tools in her kit to restore balance. And her most effective tool, I've now come to learn, is the weather. And that might sound obvious now, but I wonder if we would have thought of that before. And so on the one hand, it's obvious, but on the other, if you're not that connected in with Gaia's energy, or you're thinking all this stuff I'm talking about sounds a bit woo-woo, to me it makes perfect sense. Of course she can and would do that. She is the divine mother of our realm, of this 3D realm. And it's also a beautiful reminder that we are not needed here. We're not needed, and that might make you feel bad, but let's reassess this. We're not needed. We are wanted. We're wanted here. We forget this and we take this part for granted. So we must remember as well that if we don't respect our broader family, if we cause all or any other life harm, then we can be expended to protect the greater whole. And that has happened before, and it can happen again. And we think, say, about the Great Floods, for instance. It's happened before and it can happen again. I don't want this to sound harsh, although it is, but I think that this message holds beauty and that we actually need to be more brave and courageous in hearing this message, but also hold more humility, be humble enough to listen. And the message was very clear. We caused that earthquake in Melbourne. We caused it with our vibration of fear and anger and judgment. And I think she chose an earthquake for very good reason, because like I said earlier, if it was a flood or a fire, we'd just easily find a way to blame the other side for this problem. Or we could point the finger at this third entity of climate change, which gives an answer but doesn't provide any solutions. It's just more blame, and I will get to that in a minute. This earthquake, the choice of this earthquake, it comes from the core of Gaia. And we were in such an ungrounded state that it makes perfect sense that this was required to pull us all back to ground. And this earthquake left us puzzled and wondering why. And for once, there was no answer. There was no one to blame. We all just witnessed it and we responded on our instinct. And this event, but more importantly, our response to this event, recalibrated the frequency of our very hurt, very detached, very scared, very angry collective. So the other very interesting side to the cause of why this earthquake happened, the message from the records mentioned that this was Gaia's response ultimately. Yes, it was to our energy, the energy of the collective, this fear energy really throwing the frequency of the earth off balance in my particular part of the world. But that ultimately she is also working to balance the influence of the elite controllers, or whatever you want to call them, and specifically the dishonoring of this universal law, as the records stated, of free will of man. And I hope you understand when I say man, I don't like changing the language that comes through in the channeling. I just read it as it is, but we're talking about humanity here. That this imposition on our free will, this controlling of our movement, of our freedom of choice to decide what happens with our bodies, with our time, this heightened level of control that we all experienced firsthand, that this power structure aimed to justify by what was happening in the world, whether you believe it was real or not is irrelevant with what we're talking about here. It happened. This is the way it happened. And it's the same thing if you believe that the strict rules and strict controls that were imposed in that time as a response to what was happening was justified, also irrelevant. All I'm talking about is the reality of what we all experienced, what we witnessed here. And according to the message from the records, that this response went a bit too far in going against the universal law of free will of man, of humanity. And that not only did the imbalance of energy in the collective need attention, but so did this extreme imposition of the ruling elites. And this message from the records kind of talked about this being sort of like a natural progression of this increasing control of our will that we're probably going to keep experiencing. It feels like to me that this issue is going to get more and more intense or frequent or disempowering for us as just individual working class people as time goes on. And for me, I think it's probably a bit of a karmic challenge for us to stand up for ourselves, make our voices heard about our boundaries and what we're willing to accept. It's a challenge for us to assert our free will. This doesn't have to be about the situation we live through. This can also be about other situations, future situations that may occur where we aren't allowed to exercise the full extent of our free will, which is a natural law. It is a universal law. Yes, so that's all I'll say about that. I think that was a very, very interesting little fragment of wisdom that we can all be mindful of, that actually when things become too unnatural, like when our will is controlled, like when imposing forces start to limit our ability to enact our free will, that Gaia has our backs, that she becomes our protective mother then and steps in to make sure those controlling powers understand that they have gone a bit too far. I think that's all I'll say about that. I really want you to sit with that and think about it and think about what it might mean for the future and also events past. I did make note of climate change and that I would address that. I had a lot of notes to discuss, but we're already at 56 minutes, so I actually think they're better saved for a separate discussion. But I will mention before I close this episode out that I think it's very interesting that the wisdom from the records was saying that climate change is not the only cause for wild, extreme, and violent weather events, that there are other reasons that they can occur, and that we should be thinking more deeply about that. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for sticking with me this far, for receiving this beautiful message of wisdom, for keeping an open mind as we talked about some contentious issues. If you found this episode interesting, I would love it if you could leave me a rating or a review on your podcast player. This would be especially helpful if you are on Spotify because something's going on that platform. But I will appreciate your feedback no matter how it comes. You can also chat to me and other listeners about this episode in the Initiates Telegram chat group. So if you'd like to join us, we'd love to meet you. Just follow the link in the show notes to join us on Telegram. Thank you again for listening. I can't wait to join you next week. And until then, I wish you peace, I wish you love, and I wish you calm, grounded harmony.